All right, so we left off kind of talking about discrimination. So we'll talk about a couple other ways we could think about discrimination impacting wages. We'll take a look at a few papers and talk about kind of some regression results, how we use coefficient estimates a little bit more. Both the papers I have up there on Canvas, so if you want to take more of a look at them, and we'll kind of, they're related to discrimination. And then on Thursday, I'm guessing we'll get through kind of all the discrimination stuff today. So we'll probably start looking at kind of college athletics, thinking about kind of amateur players. But I'm also going to bring in a data set that we'll kind of work with in Excel on Thursday. So we'll kind of focus on the regression stuff kind of from the papers, analyzing the results, the tables that we see, and then we'll kind of build a few tables and analyze the results on Thursday. So let's kind of jump into things here. So we talked about employer discrimination last class, and we kind of came to the conclusion that, if every employer is discriminatory, we're going to see whatever that group is that's being discriminated against, see lower overall wages. Right? Now, if we just had one team, we said, well, wages might go up a little bit, but there's no competition. As soon as we get two teams competing for players, as long as we have two non-discriminating teams, we kind of see the equilibrium wage being offered to players will match exactly what they're worth to the team or what it would have been without it. Right? Now, we could complicate this a little bit. If there's a relatively small number of players in each team, maybe some players get paid their wage, other players end up on discriminatory teams. But the idea is, as we have two, at least there's competition for these players that drives that wage up. So what if we have employee discrimination? Right? So this doesn't necessarily have to be related to like any characteristic of their employer. I mean, their employer is technically the team. This could actually go along with the discussion we had last class, which is if you're discriminating against me, well, then I'm going to be discriminating in my supply of labor towards you because that's going to be additional cost to me. So we can really think about this as they're being discriminatory. It doesn't have to be necessarily based off of the owner, race or anything like that. But it could just simply be I'm discriminatory towards you because you're discriminatory towards me, right? But it's going to be more costly for me to play on your team, right? So maybe we've got some kind of employee discrimination going on. Now, the way this could also work is that it could be based off of race or gender or any of these other kind of characteristics we typically think about in terms of discrimination, where if the employer has people working for them, for instance, we could use, I think, the domestic and foreign example from last class. Let's say we've got players or employees who are discriminatory towards foreign players. Well, then as soon as a team puts one foreign player on their roster, those employees will be discriminating towards supplying their labor to that team, right? Because it's got other players that are in this group that they're discriminating against. So it could be against the other employees that are on that team, could be against the actual owner. And it could be directly related to them being discriminatory, or it could be related to just their own discrimination towards playing with a certain type of group, right? Other players who are in a group that are discriminatory against. So let's say we kind of think about this then as they don't feel like whatever their wage they're getting, they actually feel like they're getting paid a little bit less, right? You could also model this a little bit differently. So you could think about either the wage that they are getting, they feel like they're getting that minus, and here kind of D is going to be somewhere within 0 to 1. So it's almost like the percent of their wage they don't feel like they're realizing because they're discriminatory, right? They have to bear this additional cost. Another way might be, easier way to think about it is if I play for this team, I'll be getting my wage, and then there will be some additional cost to me, right? And really here, if we break this down, all this is that. So really, this is just trying to capture that additional cost to that employee to supply their labor. So, different ways to kind of think about this or model this, but really both will have kind of the same outcome. The only reason why sometimes we like this is because it allows for that cost to vary with whatever the player's wage is. And also it allows us to kind of give an intensity to that discrimination, right? We could do that by just increasing the cost, to playing for that team, which is really what this is reflecting. But here we can kind of play around with, well, if there's different intensities, how much would we see a shift in kind of what the wage the player feels like they're actually getting? Now, talking about this in terms of what wage does this player feel like they're actually getting, we could also think about this as there's an additional cost to supplying labor to that team, right? If I'm discriminatory towards some of their other employees or towards their owner, I guess we could also think about it that way. So if we're looking at this labor market, right, and we've got this demand curve for labor, and let's say on one team, it's, how do we want to label this? I'm going to go teams that only have domestic players, and then teams that have at least one foreign player, which is the group that we'll think about as being discriminated against. Okay. So we're going to assume for a second that the demand for labor from both of those teams is exactly the same. So there's no employer discrimination, right? They don't care. These two teams don't care. One that has only domestic players, the other that has at least one foreign player. And the value of that player is going to be the same to either team. We'll kind of assume that for a second. So we don't have any kind of differences in demand coming from the employer. They're coming from the teams. However, if you think about the supply curve for labor, so the supply curve for labor from a discriminating employee or a discriminating player here, right? You think about would result in a certain kind of equilibrium wage. So we'll think about this as if they play for the team with domestic players. And then down here, they play for the team with domestic players. So if there's an additional cost incurred to playing on that team with people that I am discriminatory towards, so we can think of this as like the marginal cost, right? Supply represents marginal costs. Well, there's essentially higher costs, right, now to playing for that team. So what should happen to this supply curve? So when we say increase, right, it's actually going to decrease, but it's going to shift upward. Yeah, right? So at every quantity, the cost is now higher because, right, I have this additional, cost of discrimination to playing with whatever group I was discriminating against. So when we look at the supply curve for labor to those teams that have foreign players, we're going to see a decrease in the supply curve from whatever player is being discriminatory. So the wage that they would have to be paid somewhere up here, they would supply, we kind of think about less labor. Now, if I'm the team and I'm looking at this player's value hasn't changed at all in terms of, right, we're on that same demand curve. So you can almost think about it, if the team wants to get this quantity of labor, right? So if that supply curve shift backward, in order to hire that player, we'd have to pay them a higher wage, but they would supply kind of a lower quality, right? Or we would just be paying fewer of them, right? We think about this in two ways. Either we employ less of these discriminating employees, or the ones that we employ, right, we're going to get fewer kind of quality labor hours out of them. So let's say instead, I want to ensure that I'm getting, instead of thinking about the number of players, let's just think about this as a labor market for one individual player. Right? So there's a demand curve for that player. There's how much they would supply. So now our measure is like the number of hours or the number of quality hours that they're going to give us. Well, we need them, or the number of games. We need them to play the same number of games. We're going to require all of our players to put in the same amount of time. And so if I wanted to get the exact same quantity of labor, the exact same quality of labor hours here, and I force that player to kind of supply this much, right? Or if I would think about if they were to, well, I would actually have to pay them a much higher wage, right? So this is kind of like a hypothetical wage here. I don't know, how can I denote this? I'll call this hypothetical. Right? So notice, if I wanted to get the same quantity of labor, I'd have to pay that discriminating employee a much higher wage than the non-discriminating employee. Not only that, the wage I'm paying them, if I think about the value that they're bringing into my team minus the cost, which is the wage, we'll notice here the wage is actually going to be above that value that the players bring in, because our demand curves reflected the amount of additional revenue brought in from the additional wins from this player. So to hire that discriminating employee, I'm going to have to pay a premium. I'm going to have to pay them more than what I'm going to get out of them, right? Whereas if I hire the non-discriminating employee, right, down here in this supply curve, well, that's just going to be the equilibrium, this lower wage. I'll pay them exactly what the value they bring into my team. Okay. So, you know, what is this going to suggest, right? If I have to pay these employees who are discriminatory a higher wage to get the exact same kind of value, what do you think teams are going to do? If quality is the same, right? So here I've assumed that the quality of the players are the same. So I've got almost think about it as, you know, this was an employee who was going to go on a team where they weren't discriminatory towards one where they were. But you could also think about if we had two players of equal talent, one is not discriminatory, the other is, right? This would also be that the non-discriminatory player would accept that lower wage and you'd be getting the exact same value, right? So if there are quality differences, like what could be an issue? So let's think about, so first of all, are there any kind of questions just over anything I want to do here? I think I'm going to do another graph here just to not complicate this one. Okay. So let's think about, so, you know, the implications would be that employers are going to be more likely to hire those non-discriminating employees. Right? But what's the issue going to be if that discriminating employee is really, really good, right? So, let me set my colors here. So the demand for labor, remember, is that value of the marginal wins coming from that labor, which was just the marginal revenue per win multiplied by the number of additional wins that player would bring in. This kind of captures, we can almost think about it as player quality. So I'll often refer to kind of the quality of players, and we're thinking about there, they would add a higher number of additional wins. So let's assume for a second that we've got two players. We'll just kind of boil this down. So two players. Here we go. This is player one. Okay. And then we're also going to think about player two, and we're going to say player two has a higher quality, right? So player two, even we're thinking about the same team, two players, so the marginal revenue per win should be the same. But if one player is of higher quality, we'll say player two. So, oops, is greater than player one. All right, we're assuming that player two is of higher quality. We then think about maybe they have, and we'll just assume this for a second to kind of make the model a little easier. They have the exact same supply for labor if they are on a team where they wouldn't be discriminatory towards. So let's say we have something like this, right? So supply of labor for person one and for person two is exactly the same if they're on a team where there's no one that either one of them would discriminate against, right? So this is kind of like almost think about there is no discrimination. Well, then, you know, we can identify the equilibrium wage would be higher for player two, right? They're of higher quality. Okay. What if player two is also discriminatory? Right? So if player two is also discriminatory, and we're thinking about the team in question that these two players are going to be on, is a team that has players of the group that player two doesn't want, you know, is discriminatory towards. Okay? Like I said, this could actually be even individual, right? Maybe, I don't know, KD doesn't want to play with LeBron, or you know, name your two players that they don't want to play with each other. The same kind of model would actually predict this. So if that's the case, then we think about the supply curve for player one doesn't change at all. They're not discriminatory, but player two was. So where would player two supply for labor be? It's actually going to be, right, a little bit lower. Okay. We can kind of think about, so this player was of higher quality, right? And they were willing to supply less of their labor because they were discriminatory. If I wanted to get the exact same quantity of labor from both of these players, right? So it's exact same quantity. So we'll call this Q1, and it's the same here. What would have to be true is that the wage I could offer to player one is just going to be where our supply and demand curves intersect, right? There's no discrimination. They don't have the higher quality. But for player 2, right, without the discrimination, I'd be willing to pay them a much higher wage, right? However, with discrimination, right, if I want to get the same quantity of labor from them, I know that, and I didn't draw this completely perfect, but this is okay. This maybe points out that these 2 points wouldn't necessarily always be in the same, just depends on the size of the shifts. To get that same quantity of labor, I'm now going to have to pay that higher quality player wherever we're at on their supply curve. Right? Now, am I okay with that? Well, as long as that wage is below the value of that player to my team, then I'd be okay doing that, right? So notice here, I have an example where, well, what's the value of that player to the team? It's going to be wherever we're at on that demand curve. So we can think about that value would be wherever we're at on that demand curve. So this would be a scenario where we'd still be willing to pay this player this higher wage, right? Because the amount that we're paying them is still less than the value that they bring to the team. Yeah.
This is where the player is discriminatory?
Yeah, so this is player 2 is discriminatory towards, whatever group, whatever other employees belong to the group that they're discriminating against. Yep. But it's like a combination, right? They're discriminatory, but now we threw in this additional wrinkle of they're also of higher quality. Because before, if they weren't higher quality, why am I going to pay them that higher wage when the value I'm getting from them is much, much lower, right? So let's say we had a, discriminatory player who had the same quality as player one, so they see that decrease in their supply curve, so I have to pay them this higher wage. Well, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm going to hire the non-discriminating employee. But if that discriminatory employee has a much higher quality, well, potentially I still employ that player because if their discrimination isn't large enough, right, then potentially the value they would bring to the team would still be greater than the wage. Right? Now, this is kind of a hypothetical thinking about, if I'm wanting to get the exact same labor supply from both of them, if we allow labor supply to kind of shift, right, we would see that the equilibrium point would be here. But maybe we could think about, we need to get the same number of games played from both of these players. What would kind of the decision making be?
So then if players being discriminatory and they're like the same quality, discriminatory, so you wouldn't hire them. But that then make like the entire like graph dead weight loss since they lost out on being hired.
So you wouldn't hire them. Only if there isn't a non-discriminating player that you could hire in their place, right? Because if you can go out and get a non-discriminatory player of the exact same quality, we didn't lose out on anything, right? I'm still realizing all the surplus. But if I can't, you're right, I lose out on everything, right? The entire, what would be, without discrimination, the perfectly competitive equilibrium, I would lose out on all that surplus if I can't find an equal quality player to replace them. Although I'm losing out on that, even though I can't find an exact same quality player, I'm probably going down to the next highest quality non-discriminating. So it's not really like that total area is dead weight loss because I still find someone, and then it just matters, well, what's the rate of decline in marginal wins per labor coming from these players? That would complicate it. Yeah, you'd have actual numbers in front of you where you'd have to kind of figure out what the actual dead weight loss was, because you did find someone to hire, they just weren't of the exact same quality. So there will be a loss, but not the entire area once you find that other player. Does that make sense? Okay. So in this case, they would still kind of decide to kind of hire that employee, but you can imagine, well, what if they were like really discriminatory, right? And so maybe something like this, right? So still player 2. I guess I'm doing it in a different color. If you don't have different colors here, maybe you could do call this instead of S2, call it I don't know, big discrimination or something, right? So this was kind of with small discrimination, the supply from player 2. Green here is going to be supply of that second player with, they have really discriminatory tastes, right? Well, now, if I want to get that same quantity of labor, I'm going to have to pay them, a much, much higher wage. So we'll call this wage for player 2 kind of with this big discrimination. And then notice now what's the value to the team? Well, that higher quality player, their value is still down here. Now the wage they're getting paid is greater than what they actually bring to the team, and it wouldn't make sense to employ that player. So players with very large discriminatory tastes, we should see, right, teams, kind of end up not employing them, right? And they do the best they can to replace this high quality player with the next best, highest quality. Okay, so a lot going on there. We're kind of thinking about two different kind of intensities of discrimination coming from the employees, could lead to two different results. Now, both of them led to that player getting higher wages, right, than they would have otherwise. But in the one scenario, the team actually, it's still worth it for the team to hire that employee. In the second scenario, it's not. Any questions here? Keep moving. Okay. So think about quality differences we still can think about are going to be shifting this demand curve. Now we've got discrimination that potentially is going to influence that supply curve. So I've probably said a lot of this as we were working through the problems. So yeah, I already mentioned all of this. So what happens to wages? We saw kind of higher wages for, if I'm playing on a team where I'm discriminatory towards the other employees, potentially lower wages, non-discriminating against team. Oh, I didn't mention this, so I'm glad I put that bullet point in there. So if we go back here to the scenario where we just had same quality players, one's discriminatory, one's not, right? So what happens if there's only one team out there that doesn't have any foreign players, right? So every team has got, there's this player who's really discriminatory towards foreign players. And he looks at the league and 29 of the teams have foreign players on. One team only has domestic. Right? So that domestic team looks at this and says, okay, well, I know that in order to play for that other team, they would have to pay this player a higher wage, which is going to be above his value. Right? So why would they do that? I mean, if there's no other team out there willing to give you kind of this higher wage, right? What might I do, if I'm team one, right? Well, I essentially now have, oh, I didn't do this right. Let's see. Do this in green. You don't have to necessarily add this. I'm just kind of wanting to make a point here. So you don't have to add this to your graph. Well, now if I'm the only team, and I know I'm the only team that only has domestic players, I now have kind of like monopsony power, right? So what can I get away with? Well, I'll choose the optimal quantity of these discriminatory players based off of where the demand curve hits my marginal expenditure curve, and then potentially get away with paying them a lower wage. Right? So if there's only one team out there that only has, think about this way, one team that doesn't have any people in the group that these employees are being discriminatory towards, they essentially gain monopsony power, and you could see lower wages, right, for those discriminating employees. Right? Now, if there's half the league only has domestic players, well, now we have competition for this player, and kind of, there's several places where he can go that he won't be discriminatory towards, because now we've got half the league that only has domestic players. So there we wouldn't see any difference in wages. But if there's just one, they'll have that monopsony power because there's no other team that, they know no other team will be willing to pay that player as high of a wage. So if we kind of go back in time and look at, so Jackie Robinson, right, at the time, Black players in MLB were, there was several discriminating employees, right? People openly saying they wouldn't play with a Black baseball player, right? And so you could think about what would be the implications. Well, Jackie Robinson was very good, right? So he was that player too. He had that higher quality, right? That demand curve was much, much higher. Right? So if I'm thinking about all these employees now, if I decide to bring Jackie Robinson on my team, I'm going to have to pay each one of those discriminating employees a higher wage if I want them to stay on the team, right? Or provide the same quantity of labor as they were before. So I'm going to be paying, right? So we said, I'll be paying this premium. the wage I'm going to have to pay much higher than the actual value of those players. So all these discriminating employees, once I'm thinking about bringing Jackie Robinson on my team, when I go into contract negotiations, I know I'm going to have to give them a higher wage. So what did kind of was it the Brooklyn Dodgers at the time? What did they do? Oh, wait, why am I thinking about this? It was LA still, right? I don't know. You go back. It was the Dodgers, but I forget what if they were still in Brooklyn. So what did they do? Well, if I'm going to have to pay a premium for these 5 players that I have, who are all saying that they won't play with a black player, so I'm not, they're openly discriminatory, I'm going to have to pay them a higher wage to play with this player, or I'm going to get fewer kind of quality labor hours out of them. I'm just going to trade them for players who are, of similar, like they wouldn't have to be of similar quality. If I can just go out and find 5 non-discriminatory players of close to similar quality of these other 5, yeah, maybe I'll take a little bit of a hit on each one of them, right? If I can't perfectly find the exact same quality player to replace this discriminatory employee, right, the next best, player I can find who's not discriminatory is like a little bit less in quality. Well, if I lose a little bit on all 5, but I gain a ton, right, from adding, this one player, Jackie Robinson, well, then I'm okay doing that. And sure enough, that's what they did, right? So there was 5 players they traded just kind of for some mediocre players, right? So that they knew were not discriminatory, because the gains to getting Jackie Robinson were more than those losses by trading away those 5 players. So we kind of see this play out, right? We saw this play out in history. We would expect that these teams are willing to kind of replace these discriminating employees. I always thought this was like a great quote. I won't read the whole thing, but he's like, I guess Dixie Walker was one of these players who openly said, I'm not going to play with Jackie Robinson, or if, I guess you think about it, if your discrimination is high enough, there is no wage, right? I mean, it's kind of an interesting thought experiment that I'll show you here a little bit, maybe show you like one of the markers. So let's say we had, just our, I'm getting ahead of myself, supply and demand for labor. If I had a player that was so discriminatory that his supply curve goes all the way up here, well, there's no amount of money I can pay that player that forces them to do anything other than 0 as my quantity of labor I would get from that player, right? So could be the case if they say they just won't play, well, I'm still going to want to trade them, because there's now, I'd have to give them an infinite wage, right, in order for them to put any, kind of one labor hour in, and those wages are always going to be greater than the value that player actually brings to my team, right? So I can pay them these higher wages, and they will supply their labor at these wages, but what I'm paying them will be significantly more than the actual amount that I get back from having that player on my team. So why would I do that? I wouldn't. So players like Dixie Walker basically, sign their own death warrant in terms of they're definitely going to lose their job. So this the coach at the time had some pretty colorful language, talking about animals, and doesn't care about, he'll play a zebra and all this stuff. So the idea was there for him as a non-discriminating coach, all he cares about is improving the quality of his team the most. So if he has to get rid of some employees and take a little bit slightly lower quality player to replace them, that's more than okay if Jackie Robinson is going to add more to the team, which, being one of the highest quality players at the time, that was definitely the case. And maybe he, cares about winning, but he also made sure, he cares about money as well here, right? So it's not purely just based off of wins, but kind of additional revenue. If these teams are making decisions that are trying to maximize profits, then everything we've talked about in terms of discriminating employees makes sense as well. So if employees discriminate, but the employers don't, does it really matter? We kind of already talked about this, but the short answer is no, right? As long as there isn't, as long as we only don't have like 1 or 2 non-discriminating employees, as long as like all employers are non-discriminatory, well, they're never going to choose players of the same quality. They're never going to choose that non-discriminating player, because they always have to pay a wage higher than the value they actually bring in. So we kind of already looked at that a little bit. So what did I say? So the group who doesn't, so that group who's non-discriminatory, we always know we can pay them the wage exactly equal to the value of what they're bringing into the team. So we'll go with them as opposed to non-discriminating employees. We'll end up seeing kind of rosters that have more and more non-discriminating employees on it over time until eventually, right, in order, your cost or your taste for discrimination as an employee is going to basically drive you out of the labor market, right? So what's another alternative that employers could take, right? So maybe if there is discrimination going on, kind of like in Major League Baseball at the time, well, if I hire Jackie Robinson, maybe I look out there, I can't replace every single one of my players. I'm going to lose out a little bit, have to pay all of them a slightly higher wage than what they're worth. Maybe net, I'm still benefiting, right, by having Jackie Robinson on my team, but not as much as I would have been if all those current players had been non-discriminatory. So what would an alternative be? Well, basically ban the group of employees that are being discriminated against. So in the context of Major League Baseball, basically say, yeah, well, we're agreeing as owners, we're all going to have to pay our players who are discriminatory higher wages if we start to allow Black players on our team. So we're just going to force segregation, right? That way we can keep our wages where they are. We don't have to pay every single discriminating employee these much higher wages. And it probably was worth it initially for those owners to do that. In terms of the losses, every employee they probably had, I shouldn't say every, but a large percentage were probably discriminatory. As time progresses, we saw, luckily that the attitude of the nation swings, right, to not being as discriminatory towards really all minority groups, but Black players specifically here. And so over time, I start to get more and more employees who aren't discriminatory. And so the cost to adding Black players like Jackie Robinson to my team aren't as large, right? And at some point, segregation then no longer makes sense for these owners in terms of the monetary aspect. So over time, we kind of see the leagues integrate when the quality of when the quality of the Black players was significantly high and employees started to become less and less discriminatory. But it doesn't really help the in-between time, right? The end result's good. The incentives kind of push us towards a good end result, but there was a period of time where a lot of these players were really paid wages much lower from having to be kind of in the segregated league. Yeah, unfortunate, but this is our history, right? So we need to learn from it. So employer-employee discrimination. The third one, I think, is kind of easy to think about because it almost goes back to just ECON 201, where we're capturing one of these things that we can't explain, kind of these preferences and fads are often a lot of the time they're called, which is going to shift the demand curve. So yeah.
Just a quick question. Mm-hmm. So you said the group was really discriminating. Could you go back to the first graph you showed?
Yeah. So
the domestic.
Yep. It would be right. So ignore the green line. The only thing we had different here was that discriminating employees had this shift in their supply curve, right? But the non-discriminating employees, it doesn't matter what team they're on, one that has, whatever it is, foreign, domestic, or Major League Baseball, if they had Black players on their team, they're going to keep accepting the wage that's exactly equal to the value of their marginal wins, the value of the marginal wins that they bring to the team.
So the domestic, they're not discriminated against. Or I was trying to see who was discriminated.
Yeah. So think about it this way. I'll draw another one out and we'll do the context of Major League Baseball. Yes, the players are discriminating against each other. It could also be discriminating towards the owner, but we don't have as many applications or real life examples of that. But in theory, it would work the same way. But you're thinking about it this way. All right, so I'll put it in the context of Major League Baseball here. So let's just assume we have two same quality players, right? That way we can have the same demand curve for their labor. So we don't have to worry about any demand for each one's the same. So we've got the supply of labor, and think about it maybe from the scenario of when the entire league was white, right? And they're talking about adding Jackie Robinson. So every player we're thinking about here, discriminatory or not, is going to be currently a white player in Major League Baseball, right? So they would be willing to accept this wage. Right? we'll hold off on labeling for just a second. So the supply of labor is going to be, how can I maybe give you a good prefix or a good superscript for this? So their supply of labor to be on an all-white team at the time, if it was a discriminatory employee, would be exactly the same as a non-discriminating employee, right? Because there's, they're on a team that's all white, and so the discriminating employee is going to be exactly the same. So here, think about maybe, here's the supply curve for my discriminatory employee on an all-white team. And then I have my supply of labor for my non-discriminatory employee. It's going to be exactly the same. And it doesn't matter if they're on a team that's all white or if they're on a team that's, has black players on it, right? Their supply hasn't changed at all. They're not discriminatory. So the only shift we see in the supply curve for labor comes from when we've got our discriminating employee and our roster kind of has one or multiple kind of black players on it at the time, right? Which that's what's led to kind of they would only be willing to be on that team for higher wages. So we wouldn't see them, shoot. What we end up seeing is teams that have black players would then kind of be adding these non-discriminating employees because they haven't shifted their supply at all, and we can still pay them that lower wage. It's exactly equal to the value that they're going to bring in. Does that help?
Yeah,
clarify a little bit? It's okay. It gets tough because we're thinking about like each person. So you're thinking about not so much what their race is, although I guess you could have like someone hate or be discriminatory towards people of the same race as they are. But generally thinking about we have like different races or whatever of the players. But then we're really thinking about the supply for labor is coming from when they play with other players who are of this race that they're discriminatory towards.
I was thinking that that's what the black person will have to get paid to want to be on that team because he has to deal with that. If that makes sense. Yeah. So if you're thinking about, we're only thinking about here. This was like the players in Major League Baseball at the time would have been like all white. I got it. And you're right that we could complicate the model. We talked a little bit about it on last Thursday, but you could be like, you've got these discriminating players, but then you also have me basically discriminating against you because you're discriminating against me, right? So I become a discriminating employee only because you're a discriminating employer. So in all these models, we've assumed, so going through these employee discrimination, I've assumed there's no employer discrimination. There very well could be, which would then just make this even more complicated, right? Where we could see certain players shifting their supply curve in response to the employer's discrimination. Any other questions on that? Yeah.
It's going off what he's saying. If there is the player like Jackie Robinson being discriminated, he have like an additional cost onto himself for being discriminated towards an additional cost.
So that specific scenario, probably, well, as long as we had two owners that weren't discriminatory. It goes back to what we talked about on Thursday, right? So there would have to be two teams where his supply of labor wouldn't change at all because they weren't discriminatory towards him and they didn't have any discriminating employees, right? But if all teams did, well, if all employers were discriminatory at the time, this goes back to, we did a model on Thursday where he's of higher quality, but there's discrimination. So we still see him hired and get a higher wage, but it's not as high as it should have been. Remember? So it would be something like,
I say that.
Okay.
Like if other players are discriminating against him, it's like I can't play with these other players because they don't accept me. It's like I won't play unless I do a little bit more.
Yeah, and so that's even more of a that's going to speed the process up even more, because now if I'm a team and that's the scenario, well, now I'm not only going to have to pay those discriminating employees more to play with Jackie Robinson, I'm going to have to pay him more to play with them, right? So it's basically he becomes a discriminating employee as well, but it's only in response to the other ones. Yeah. Yep. So I'd have to pay not only the premium on my current white discriminating players, if I keep them, when I add Jackie Robinson, I now say, well, his supply of labor on a team that isn't discriminatory, right, that doesn't have any discriminating players, his supply curve is going to be whatever it is. But now to play on my team with 10 other players who are going to be discriminatory towards him, well, that's an additional cost to him. So his supply curve is going to kind of decrease. So now if I want to still put in my team, I am going to have to pay him a higher wage than what I would have otherwise had to if I didn't have any discriminating kind of players currently on my roster. Does that kind of get at what you're?
It's from the fact for like discriminatory fans, because like when teams are assigned like Jackie Robinson, I'm sure that those teams lost a lot of fans because that was big.
Yeah, so you're getting to the third type of discrimination, which is consumer discrimination, right? And this is probably, so employer-employee discrimination is great for going back and like looking, like I said, we could kind of come up with these implications and see like that's exactly what happened in the case of history of Jackie Robinson, right? They traded away these other players so they didn't have to pay the premium. Those, I would argue, probably still exist. There probably could be some employer and employee discrimination, but my guess is where most of what we see wages being impacted by discrimination now is probably coming from consumers, right? I mean, first of all, you're just opening it up to having more people, which is just going to make it more likely you're getting some discriminating consumers. If I've only got one owner, I've kind of limited that, right? So consumer discrimination is going to work very similar to employer discrimination, right? So all it's going to do is shift that demand curve for labor, right? If we can think about why, I'll come back here in a second. Do I have anything here? Yeah, I'll just draw this out. I think I've got some kind of what the literature says and the results. So if we think about, it's going to operate slightly different than employer discrimination, and it's going to be harder to measure, like almost impossible. But we can still think about if teams are looking at their revenue information, they would be able to make this decision. So we usually say that the demand curve for labor is the value of the marginal kind of wins that player adds, which was the marginal revenue per win times that player's quality or the number of additional wins they bring in. So if I have consumer discrimination, so think about maybe at the time, if I hire or I kind of give a contract to Jackie Robinson and I've got consumers who are discriminatory, well, some of them may decide not to attend the games, right? Oh, you could actually see this now, like maybe with some PC, kind of like if there's a player maybe who said something or did something, right? I can, maybe fans boycott the games, right? I don't know. LeBron James doesn't speak out about the atrocities in China, and so some people decide they don't want to go to Lakers games anymore, right? And so really what you're saying there is, I'm going to have lower revenue per win now because I have fewer fans attending the games, maybe fewer people buying apparel. So consumer discrimination still shifts my demand curve like employer discrimination did, but it's not out of this tape. Like isn't this fixed component we build in there. It's operating through decreasing the marginal revenue that a team gets per win. Okay, so we can think about without consumer discrimination, right? Everything is just kind of think about here's our equilibrium wage and quantity. With consumer discrimination, we're basically going to see this decrease in our demand curve, right? So if my demand curve decreases, well, out of no fault of the player, he's the same quality, he brings in the same number of additional wins. It's just that there's less revenue attached with each of those wins because I have a discriminatory consumer, fan base, right? And so now the wage, we'll call this 2. And so, quantity, right? The second equilibrium quantity, or after this consumer discrimination, we see fewer kind of players who are that consumers are discriminatory towards being employed or given contracts to on the team, and they would pay for lower wages. But the interesting thing here is if they can find another fan base that isn't discriminatory, well, then they would actually be able to earn a higher wage. And even if we wanted to think about the thoughts experiment where even if we could keep their quantity of labor the same, if they can find a non-discriminatory team where the marginal revenue per win would be higher because people don't care that Jackie Robinson is black, they just want to see someone play awesome baseball, right? Well, then they'd be willing to pay this person a much higher wage, right, than the team that has a discriminating fan base. Right? So what we would end up seeing there is what teams would end up probably increasing in quality as a result of this. The teams that have a fan base that is not discriminatory, right? They're always going to be able to offer that higher quality player a higher wage because that player brings in more money to that team or has a higher value to that team than the one that has a lower marginal revenue per win because of their discriminatory consumer fan base. Right? Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Like I said, it operates very similar to employer discrimination. And also in the same vein, if I only had one team that has a consumer fan base that's, not discriminatory, well, what could I do? Well, I know that every other team's going to pay this lower wage. So I could offer something slightly higher, right? But as soon as I have two teams that have non-discriminatory fan bases, well, now we're going to both keep just offering slightly higher amounts to the player, and we'd end up kind of back up to what their wage should be. So we really just need two consumer fan bases that aren't discriminatory, just like we need just two employers to kind of deal with this, the negative wage effects of discrimination. But, we're probably not thinking about like having a discriminatory consumer fan base or not. We're probably thinking about a much more complicated model where there's actually like several different intensities, right? Maybe one team, 1% of their fan base is somewhat discriminatory, maybe 5% in one, 3% in the other. Hopefully they're that low, right? But so we think about we just have a lot more demand curves on here, right? Every team is going to be slightly different because of their percent of their fan base is discriminatory. So we can kind of think about, right, it's really operating through the consumer's discriminating tastes, lower kind of the amount of revenue made in the ticket market, apparel market, et cetera, et cetera. That then has labor market impacts, which it's decreasing the demand curve for labor, which forces the wages of those players down. What's interesting, though, is if you have a discriminating consumer fan base, it would not only impact the players who the fan base was discriminatory towards. Every single player, the marginal revenue per win, that just is whatever the marginal revenue per win is on that team. So this could actually potentially lower wages for every player in the league. That's the one difference that consumer discrimination would have as opposed to employer, right? This not only impacts players that the fan base doesn't like, it impacts every player on that team, right? Lowering the marginal revenue per win for the team. So now every player on the team, it will be lower for as well. So there's some evidence of this. There's a paper, and we won't look at this one specifically, but I wanted to mention it. It's a little bit older, where they found that Black players earn 20% in NBA, 20% less than white players, all else equal. And really, they also paired this with, so they didn't want to say, the NBA teams are like discriminatory, right? But what they also found was evidence that maybe part of this is operating through the consumer fan base. And so, like, you can imagine, if you have this high quality player, but they don't want to go play in Philly because Philly fans have a reputation, well, then maybe they end up taking a lower wage to go somewhere else, right? Even though that really would have been where they could have gotten the highest wage, or New York, or, you name it. Right? So they also looked at attendance as their kind of dependent variable. And they actually found that, and I think this was over the course of a year, obviously not for one game, but if you increase the percent, I believe they used this starting lineup. So one more player would always be a 20% increase in terms of what percent of your team was white, non-white. I forget exactly how they coded it. So they're only looking at the starters here. If you replace one of your starters who was Black with a white player, they actually found an estimate of about anywhere from 8,000 to 13,000 annual increase in attendance, right? So there is some evidence, at least looking at attendance numbers, and this was holding out everything else constant, right? Age of the player, how many years they've been in the league, kind of the different statistics to measure quality. So two otherwise equal quality players, but one of them's black, one of them's white. If you add the white player, we saw attendance kind of be that much higher over the course of the entire year, right? So there is evidence that the consumers are somewhat discriminatory, which is bad, but that's what their findings were. So I want to make sure I get through both those papers. So we might even save a little bit of discrimination towards the next class, but I think I'll at least touch on this, and then we might go look at the papers. And if we have time, we'll kind of revisit the very last thing about discrimination. So what if we have kind of one group that has higher productivity than another group, right? So maybe we look at, I always think a good example, because we always think about racism, or, generally flowing one direction, but, just like with the referee paper, right? We can see race, kind of intra-race discrimination going on in several different directions. So here, maybe think about NFL running backs. Right? On average, right, if you look at just kind of the performance, the group of black running backs has much higher performance than white running backs. Like that's just the averages, right? I'm not, not saying anything about race and what they're performing. I'm just saying if you looked at the averages, that just happens to be the scenario. And that could be a result of things that occurred, in high school or college that were discriminatory or racist. But if you just look at the averages and that's all you had, you would, if you wanted to get the best player and you didn't know who it was, well, you would take a random player, a random black running back versus a random white running back, right? And a lot of people maybe argue this, you could go through different positions as well, where maybe you have white players on average having better statistics than the black players at that position, right? And, if that's all the information you have, then that's what we would call statistical discrimination, right? You look at the average, you don't have any other information about the player, then maybe it makes sense to just, if I'm getting someone from the group that has a higher average, I higher probability that they end up performing better than the person who's from the lower. But there's distributions, right? This statistical discrimination doesn't make any sense when you can actually measure what the person is like. So if we just think about distributions, right? So maybe this is the distribution for, we'll call this, I'll keep using my example. So black running back, and then this is kind of just a shorthand for the mean, right? So maybe if we had one composite thing that was trying to rate the quality of these players, here's the mean, but there's going to be some players, some black running backs who are not that good, some who are better than that, right? And then maybe I looked at, kind of here was my kind of white running back mean. We said that was kind of lower on average, but there's a distribution, right? So if I looked at any one player, well, maybe they're the player that's out here, right? And if I look at, a black running back, maybe they're over here on that side of the distribution, right? So in this case, right, the quality of the white running back would be greater, but maybe the black running back's here and maybe the white, right? So it really depends, like on a case-by-case basis. If I'm just using kind of the averages to make my decisions, more likely, it's very possible I end up with someone from the group who had a higher average quality measure that's actually on the left side of that group's distribution, right? But that is the idea, that is the justification for what some teams kind of do with their statistical discrimination. So they usually do this when information is costly or difficult to obtain. So I don't, I would argue this is probably going on less with race in terms of teams using statistical discrimination to make decisions, because you can meet players, you can evaluate their tape, it doesn't matter what their race is, you can really get a pretty good idea about what their quality might be. But if it starts to become really hard to predict who's going to be successful when you draft them, maybe you start using attributes to make decisions based off of whatever the average of that group is. So for instance, a lot of teams have done this lately with quarterbacks, right? It used to be this age-old adage in the NFL that if a quarterback was under 6 feet tall, they couldn't be successful, right? That if you looked at the average performance in the NFL of quarterbacks who were less than 6 foot, it was lower than the average performance of quarterbacks that were above 6 feet. So teams, it's very hard to predict if your first round quarterback draft pick is actually going to be successful. So they start to look for these attributes where on average, if you have these characteristics, you're better, right? So they started giving more chances to players over 6 feet, fewer chances to quarterbacks who were less than 6 feet, right? Now it's kind of changing now because more and more quarterbacks who are 6 foot or a little bit shorter have started having some success. So now the statistical discrimination doesn't make any sense, right? Or maybe they look at things like hand size or all these different characteristics, which it's not how we think about discrimination. We usually think about it, like I said, based off of race, gender, these other things, but that's really what they're doing. They're just discriminating based off of these other measurable attributes, right? You can't control can't control your palm size any more than you can control what your race is, right? And so it's a pretty good example where teams really still are using this. The problem is it leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if even I see small differences in the performance of quarterbacks who are under or over 6 foot tall, so what do I start doing? I start giving more chances to quarterbacks who are over 6 feet tall. Well, if they have more chances, it's just going to be more likely that I start to see successful quarterbacks over 6 feet tall, right? So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy if I use statistical discrimination in my hiring practices, right? Same thing with race. If I started to make coach hiring decisions based off of race, well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I think that a non-white coach can't have success, well, they're never going to get opportunities to have success, right? So I've literally, what I think is true, I made it true. It wasn't necessarily that it is. I've just forced it because I'm not giving that group any opportunities, right? So we don't, if we didn't have information on some things, statistical discrimination does make sense in the context of life, right? Not in regards to like race or gender, but if I'm, if I, look at, I don't know, what would be a good example of this in our everyday lives? I'll give you a good one, right? So maybe we'll put it in the context of sports. So if I'm thinking about, I've got some hobby, right? Maybe this is, an individual sport where I go and I compete, right? And I'm choosing between two competitions. Am I going to go to the city that has maybe a population of 500, where I don't really know who's competing, but I know it's people from that area, or go to somewhere that has a population of 5 million? Well, with 5 million people, there's a much higher probability that there are some really, really elite people at whatever this competition is, right? Out of 500, less likely, right? And so I probably would use statistical discrimination there, thinking about the average performance of a town of 500, it's probably gonna be lower than the average performance at this competition or sport in a city of 5 million, right? So maybe it makes sense there, but in the context of what we're doing here, it's always gonna kind of lead to this self-fulfilling prophecy and really limit the opportunities of whatever group we're using statistical discrimination towards. So we'll kind of maybe revisit this next week. It's got some positional discrimination stuff we can kind of think about. So we'll wrap that up on Thursday. What do I want to go to? I wanted to hit escape and then look at these papers. So I think the first one that I want to look at, and I actually have slides for this to make it easier. So if I scroll down here, where is it at? Racial discrimination in the NFL. Right? So we got this paper, but I pulled a lot of stuff out for it and put it in slides to make it a little bit easier. And then we'll look at the PDF of the other one. So from 1992 to 2002, 7 of the 92 head coaching positions, right, were minority candidates, right? So I believe this is thinking about head coaching jobs as head coach, but there's movement in and out. Right. So it's not there's just 30 head coaches. It's over this entire time span. A lot of coaches work for several years. Some of them don't. So we had 92 different vacancies, right? Ability to hire coaches. Only 7 of those times was there a minority candidate hired. So the NFL saw this. They're like, this is a problem, right? And so they instituted this thing called the Rooney Rule, which I forget all the exact details, but the idea is that you have to at least interview a minority candidate when you have this head coach position open, right? Or you have a coaching position open. So after that, we saw the kind of number rise from 7 to about 17, and it was out of about the same number, right? Not quite as many vacancies, but about the same. So a much higher percentage of minority coaches were being hired in these interview processes, right? So we've got the racial composition. So what? 72% white and 27% black if we look at all coaching positions, right? So it's already skewed a little bit. And, you know, we could say, is this a good or a bad thing? Well, it doesn't line up with the kind of percent breakdown we see of the players in the NFL, right? But it's a little bit higher than just overall the population in the US, right? So, you know, we could go either way on that. So this paper wanted to look at, you know, whether or not we can control for all these other factors. Does it look like being, you know, black as opposed to white decreases my chances of getting this head coaching position or any coaching position? So one thing we can think about, we could see some discrimination going on is what we call allocative discrimination, right? So it could be that initially, right, it's more likely that we're hiring coaches into lower wage positions or positions that have lower starting wages, right? And that means less likely that they're starting out in the positions that have higher wages, right? So this would be the idea that when they initially get hired, they're less likely to get hired as a college coach at University of Alabama, right? And more likely to be hired as a coach at, I don't know, pick your seal. What are some of the schools, Alabama, A&M, or, you know, one of the smaller kind of schools in the state. Right? So maybe it's that their initial job, even in college, or their initial kind of position starting in the NFL is lower. So maybe it's more likely that a white candidate gets a job as a quarterbacks coach as opposed to a black candidate. And maybe it's more likely the black candidate is getting, you know, I don't know, DB coach or wide receiver coach, which if we look at the path to becoming a head coach, usually it's a little bit more likely if I start out as a quarterback coach as opposed to these other position coaches, right? So maybe I've got some things where discrimination isn't going on in the process of determining who is the head coach, but the reason why black candidates are less likely to be hired as a head coach is because they were less likely to be even hired as a coordinator, or even less likely to be hired at these positions that are more likely to become head coaches, right? So the discrimination was like way back in the future, or in the future, way back in the past, right? So within job, this would just mean how we typically think of discrimination, right? I've got two coaches, they're both offensive coordinators, you know, but the black coach is less likely to be hired as a head coach. That's kind of the traditional within job, right? But the allocative one could be what's happening as well. Okay? So if we think about the hierarchy in the NFL, generally you've got a head coach, you have two coordinators, and they kind of have position coaches underneath them, right? And each one of these different position coaches has a different probability of being hired as a coordinator, right? So for instance, if I'm looking at my defensive coordinator, and I don't know if this is true off the top of my head, but I'm using this as an example. If I'm a special teams coach, right, it's more likely that a special team coach becomes a defensive coordinator and less likely that a linebacker coach becomes a defensive coordinator. But it's more likely that we have black coaches being hired as linebacker coaches and more likely we have white coaches being hired as special teams. Well, then we have allocative discrimination going on, right? Because now the path to getting the head coach is going to be easier for that special teams coach as opposed to the linebacker, right? So that will be kind of the idea. If we look at the breakdown, we see very different percentages in terms of race at each one of these different coaching positions. So this was, I forget what year of the data they were looking at the time. Kind of if we think about our first coaching job, so this isn't what their current job, but what was their first job in the NFL? Notice there wasn't a single black coach in the sample where their first position was an offensive, defensive coordinator or a head coach. Right? Not, you know, who would these coaches be? Probably college coaches that were getting hired as their first job. And you then kind of look at the breakdown of these other first positions. Well, look at the quarterback coach. I mean, almost exclusively white, not quite, right? And then you've got other positional coaches that are, you know, have a higher percentage of Black than white coaches, but there's definitely variation across each one of these different position coaches. So if some position coaches have easier paths to becoming coordinators, we're going to see some what we call kind of allocated discrimination. Right? And don't worry about this. I think this is maybe a little more complicated than what I wanted to go through. But basically, this is all this was getting at, is that these bars represent a defensive coordinator has the highest probability of being hired as a head coach, offensive coordinator next highest, DB coach, offensive line, quarterbacks coach, et cetera, et cetera. And then the paper also kind of thinks about, well, maybe there's something going on with, a lot of our coaches in the NFL were also players. And so maybe it's not just their race, but like what position they played in college. Right? So maybe we think about that they're given different opportunities based off of what position they played. And we look at the positions that are played in NFL, the percentage, the racial percentage or the percent that are white or percent that are Black in each position also varies, right? So maybe it's not through like actual evil intent discrimination. Maybe it's just coming out of the fact that different players who play different positions are given different opportunities, right? So they run this regression, and we'll kind of give you what the equation would look like. So we'll think about this. So here we've just got basically, were they hired 1 or 0 is our dependent variable. We then have our intercept. We have the slope coefficient or the slope estimate on whether or not that coach was Black. So this is just a 1-0 variable. So this is the primary variable of interest. A 1 unit increase in my X variable would be if a coach was Black relative to white, what's the change, or what's the change in the predicted value of whether or not they're hired? Well, if I have a 1-0 variable, we said the predicted change really represents increases or decreases in the probability of belonging to the 1 group versus the 0 group. So here, a Black coach relative to a white coach, for the group that's a 1 relative to 0, the expected increase or decrease in whether or not they're hired would be whatever that beta 1 is, right? Where that slope coefficient is. And then, we add in a bunch of controls. So, there's a bunch of, we try to get performance measures of that coach in terms of how their current team or in their current position, how that they're performing. Maybe we do age, we do a whole bunch of different controls there, right? So that's the kind of regression equation we're looking at. So now here they've bolded, right, this variable they want you to pay attention to. They have different performance measures. And I forget exactly what they all are. If you kind of go through the paper to be a little more detailed, their coach's age, experience, whether or not they were a coordinator or not, because we know that coordinators are more likely to be hired. So we're controlling for this now. Essentially, if we include all these additional controls, we can control for that allocative discrimination. And really, this should be reflective just of within job discrimination. They did things here where they change the dependent variable. So usually it's head coach. So were they hired as the head coach or not? And then they have this one, which is any position. Right? And then they also limit the candidates. So they say, okay, I'm looking at defensive and offensive coordinators. Are they more likely to be hired to a head coach if they're Black, right? And then they, what did they do here? Oh, so they had different time periods as well, right? They have all years before the Rooney Rule, years after. So here, if I only look at the defensive and offensive coordinators who are in the NFL, and then look at what was their probability of being hired as a head coach, if they were, oh, no, actually, I messed this up. I flipped it. It doesn't really matter. All right, instead of Black being 1 or 0, they kind of had it identified as a white. So here, instead of what's the decrease in the probability that you are hired because you're a Black coaching candidate, it's going to be the increase in the probability because you're a white candidate, right? Those are really just 2 different ways of saying the same thing. So we've got only our coordinators, offensive and defensive. The probability that we see a white coach hired, the increase in the probability that we see them hired as a head coach, we get estimates of about 0.5 and negative 0.1 here. So after the Rooney Rule, it looks like maybe they're a little bit less likely to be hired as a head coach if they're white. But really, our standard errors are so large, we don't have any significance. So if you were a coordinator, it doesn't matter if it was pre-Rooney Rule or after the Rooney Rule, it was no more or less likely that you were hired as a head coach because you were white. But that was only limiting it to defensive and offensive coordinators. Quite often, sometimes people will jump that step, right? So here, if I'm just looking at any position, right? Or sorry, actually, let's go over here first. If I'm looking at all these other different coaching positions, so not just offensive and defensive coordinator, but the tight ends coach, the special teams coach, now the probability they get hired as a head coach, if they're white, increases by about 0.74. So this huge increase in the probability that you see kind of coaches who aren't coordinators jump up to head coach, right? So this is some evidence that maybe there was some discrimination going on, not within job, right? Not where most often we see, right? Offensive, defensive coordinator to head coach, but from all these other positions, right? Well, the problem is we know these other positions, it's more likely that you hold one if you're white or black, depending on what position we're looking at least if we just look at the breakdown, right? If we went back to this guy here. So if it happens to be that more cornerback coaches are able to be hired as a head coach, well, there we would actually see that's like more likely that black coaches are hired to this head coach position, right? So maybe we want to control for what their current position is. So we'll go down here. Excuse me. So they start to add in some additional controls. You can see some of them here, but really the one I want to focus on is when they have everything in here, right? So they've got first position fixed effects. So all that means is they included an indicator variable for what that coach's first coaching position was. And they also kind of included what their current coaching position was. So it should be now, we've got two offensive coordinators. They both started out as quarterback coaches. Same experience playing in the NFL, same coaching experience at both levels. They tried throwing every control you can think of. So you've got two otherwise identical coaches. One of them's black, one of them's not. What's the additional increase in the probability, or I shouldn't say black, one of them's white, one of them's non-white, right? What's the additional increase in the probability that white coach is hired, right? So if I'm looking at kind of this column here, that was where we included all of these additional controls, right? And now it looks like the probability of being hired as a head coach, not statistically different from zero, right? Looks like there's no additional change in the probability that you're hired as a head coach if you're white relative to non-white. Holding constant, right? All those other things, which is a lot of things, right? So looks like awesome, great. We solved it once we control for everything, no discrimination going on. Problem is, if we then change our dependent variable, so I said earlier it was hired. Up to this point, we've been thinking about it hired as a head coach. Now let's change that. Actually, not offensive, it was just simply, was I hired as an offensive or defensive coordinator? And if I know that offensive and defensive coordinators are more likely to be hired as head coaches, then it would make sense. If I see discrimination going on at this level, it would impact how many black head coaches that I see when I'm just looking at the numbers. So now, if I looked at the dependent variable being, am I hired as a coordinator, holding constant, all these other things still, well, now that's where the strong effect was really coming from, right? So now if I'm white, the probability I'm hired as a coordinator, relative to a black coach, holding constant, all these other things, it increases by about 0.76, right? So the real discrimination is going on well before you get to that head coaching interview, right? So, the NFL probably didn't like this paper, right? This is evidence that they've got an issue going on in terms of hiring practices. But the Rooney Rule was specifically originally for head coaches. It doesn't talk anything about coordinators, which is where we see a lot of this actual kind of racial discrepancy going on. I think that's all I had on that paper. We're kind of ran out of time here. So we'll take a look at the other paper as well next class, finish up discrimination. We may hold off on kind of doing the college amateur stuff until next week, and I'll just bring some Excel stuff in that we can work on. That'll hopefully kind of help you as you're looking at that data for your projects, okay? All right, I'll also be putting up an online quiz. That'll be due before we start class on Thursday, right? Just a couple questions about this discrimination models. Make sure that we're understanding it, okay? All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday.